Continuing on then with world systems theory and the application of it to the US-Mexico migration system, let's look just a little bit at raw materials. Embedded in our story could be some detail on mining in the Southwest US and Northwest Mexico. Not going to emphasize that much, but just suffice it to say that there was major copper mining in Arizona and in Sonora, the state just across the border. And there were workers who were recruited from Northwest Mexico to work in those mines, and they worked on both sides of the border. And so here's what happens when you have mining: almost never does the mine get discovered right where everybody already lives. It's almost always somewhere far away. So people are recruited out. Once they're recruited from a more traditional way of living off the land, hunting and gathering in various ways, subsistence farming, once they're recruited out of that lifestyle and they experience wage labor, very few people want to go back to the old way. But then when the mines close during, like, for example, the Great Depression, when they closed, then the workers are displaced. So they don't really want to go back to what they had before. And usually by then someone else has kind of moved in to fill their role anyway. And so they're displaced people. And so this is part of the whole process of making the, as they would say, the proletariat, where we end up with new conceptions of individualism, private gain, social change, wage labor, in other words. And this is a new way of thinking. And it makes people more uprooted, more likely to move again to some other new opportunity. And in the United States, we have a long history of this, of course, as well, much of it moving west to, in this case, maybe for land. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, and this is a really big theme here, is labor itself in the whole kind of world system. The core capitalist countries, in this case the United States, they enter developing countries to establish assembly plants that take advantage of low wage rates, often within export processing zones created by sympathetic governments. The demand for factory workers strengthens local labor markets and weakens traditional productive relations. Much of the labor demand is female, however, and the resulting feminization of the workforce limits opportunities for men. Now, let's go look at a little more about this kind of geography question again. If you're going to have a bunch of plants to have hire laborers here along the Mexico border, and Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez are the two biggest areas where this happens. You don't have the labor there. These were little tiny towns that had been established due to Prohibition era. You couldn't drink in the United States, so people would go down to Mexico and drink and have a little tango in the bar and so on. And so these were kind of divey little border towns. They weren't really Mexican towns in the way that you would know traditional Mexico. They were kind of seedy places and so on. And they were small. There just wasn't very many people there who would be able to work in these factories. So what happened, though, is there ended up being huge numbers of jobs in these areas eventually. And so let's see how that whole story happens. And I'll come back to the World War II recruitment in a minute because it's really important for our story. But I want to just kind of, since we're looking at this geography question, let's look at this border industrialization program. In 1964, the border industrialization program started with Mexico, and this was right at the end of the Bracero programs that ended. Actually, it was 1965. I'm going to change that now. And the building of maquiladoras at the U.S. border resulted in a subsequent explosive growth of cities there. And what we saw was there were hundreds of thousands, even millions of people coming from the populated south of Mexico and central parts, and they came up to the border to work in these maquiladora manufacturing plants. Basically, the way they worked in their initial inception was that parts would be sent south of the border that were manufactured in the United States, would be assembled using Mexican labor, and then there would only be a tax levied on the value-added part that came back across. So let's say that you sent $10 of stuff south from that was made in the United States, and then it was assembled, and the product was deemed to have a value of $25 as it came back across, and so it was taxed on that value added part. So it saved in some taxes that you didn't have to be taxed on the whole value crossing the border was the idea. And so this made this huge border zone here with these many large now today Mexican cities of millions of people, and especially Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez. These are just jobs in the sector itself, and also Matamoros is this way. And so you have this whole kind of U.S. border region here and there with some really big numbers. And these people are not there because they always lived there and then now voila, there's a plant there. They migrated out. These are people who came from the populated parts, for the most part, of Mexico and some of the rural hinterlands here that were sparsely populated in the dry north. So it's not hard to imagine if you live at the U.S.-Mexico border that, well, first of all, if you have regular work, you can sometimes get a visa and you can go across the border and buy things in U.S. shops. That's very, very common with like sister cities on either side of the border. And the other thing is, if you're living there, it's not hard to imagine that you might decide you want to be a worker in the United States and you might cross over. Maybe you don't have documents, but if we can make more money on the other side and maybe go migrate somewhere in the interior, why not? So these became magnets here in the border. Lots of people migrate out here. It was primarily young women that were doing these jobs, and a lot of them became migrants north, or they do it with their husband, or their husband would work in the north and they would live at the border town. Very, very common arrangement. So this demand for labor at the border creates this huge migration system out of the south and central parts of Mexico to the north. And of course, these people, now that they've migrated from their traditional setting anyway, hey, just one more step to the United States. It's not hard to imagine the millions of people that flow through this system. And indeed, since 1965, major flows have come to the United States through this, what we call step migration system. Okay, so coming back then, so the border industrialization program was a major kind of story in the large movement north. But let's step back again and look at the Bracero program just a bit more. So the recruitment happened, and the way it kind of worked was you recruited in Mexico, you would work a season, usually it was for a farm or sometimes a sequence of farms, and then you would go back. And so almost entirely it was young men, and they would go back and bring their money home. And so there's this kind of circular seasonal migration pattern that established itself. And I did a bunch of work in Oregon in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Did about 70 focus groups with a bunch of community-based organizations and county programs in Clackamas County and Multnomah County mostly. And so we had probably in all those 70 or so focus groups, maybe 600 people that we talked to in one way or another. And one of the things that was fun to do, and we would often do this as kind of an icebreaker, is to say, hey, tell us the story of your family and your community. Are you the first person from your community? Or if not, who was? And when was this? And you wouldn't believe how many times people would say, pues mi abuelo vino en 47. My grandfather came in, the 1940s or something like this. I said 1947, an example there. And it was, during this time then that enormous thousands, literally thousands of small towns in Mexico established links to farming communities in the United States. And it happened because of the recruitment of these programs. Had that not happened, it would have been very hard to see this occur because most people simply could not have afforded the trip so far north. And so it wouldn't have worked out very well. So these programs, interestingly, didn't end in 1945. Which raises the question, didn't World War II end in 1945? Yes, but what happened here is that there was a relationship that was deemed largely mutually beneficial between the workers and the farmers in the United States. There were abuses. Sure, there were people who weren't happy at all with it, but it worked well enough that it kind of had its own internal momentum. And they actually canceled these programs a couple of times in the 1950s, but they kept bringing them back. And the farmers kind of got hooked on the labor. They realized that it was very reliable, low cost labor, lower cost than they could get here in the United States with U.S. born folks for the most part. And this became kind of the nature of the program. And interestingly, when those programs were temporarily terminated in the 50s, there was a group of people in South Texas who many of them had kind of Mexican heritage, but many of them went back generations in Texas. Originally, that was Mexico, and a lot of them migrated into Oregon. They come up through the Southwest and into Oregon, and then some migrated across through, say, Minnesota, sugar beet harvest and all that, and then back down. There were several different kinds of cycles that they took. So this then is a story where the seeds to the mass migrations that we had in the 90s and into 2000 up to about 2007, most of the seeds of those migration networks were laid by the recruitment going way back into the Bracero programs. And let me tell you a quick story on this. I was in the kind of the Gulf Coast area with a friend of mine who's an archaeologist in the early 90s, Brad. I met him in grad school. He was an anthropologist, archaeologist, me a geography. He'd come over and take geography grad classes. I go over there with the anthropologists and take classes. So we became buddies. And so Brad, one summer, he said, "Hey, you're going to be down. Why don't you come and visit me, and I'll show you around the state of Veracruz." And I said, "Absolutely, love it." So I went down there, and we were in Jalapa, which is like one of the coffee capital areas, Orizaba, some of those areas near the Gulf Coast, but up higher. And so we went down to some real villages, rode a bus in there, and I'm looking around, and it's like, we really seem different. And I said, "Brad, I don't get a sense here." I said, "I don't see a lot of the vehicles that you would see like in Central Mexico, where I've been working. I don't see any evidence that people are driving vehicles, have U.S. plates here. I didn't see any around." And he looks at me and goes, "No." He said, they weren't recruited here in World War II in this area. And he said the people here, frankly, are too poor. For them, migrating to Mexico City, which is only a few hours away by bus, he said migration to Mexico City was a big thing. The idea of migrating in those days to the United States was still out of the question for almost everyone in this region. So this shows you the importance of those recruitments back in the 1940s and onward that paved the way for the mass migrations out of Mexico. We would still have had migrations out of Mexico in later years, to be sure, but nothing like what we had.